Morning again, everyone. You'll notice that when Len was talking, it was pouring down, and then the Prime Minister arrives, and it just absolutely stops there. Yeah. So I'd like to introduce the Prime Minister, the Minister of Tourism, who is very popular in tourism circles this week, to talk to us, and then we'll have a shortish Q&A session once the Prime Minister has finished speaking. So, Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
That's right. Martin, thanks very much. Firstly, can I just welcome everyone here to the Cloud? Some of you will be from overseas, so I don't know how many of you have been here before, but this was the venue we hosted the Rugby World Cup at in 2011. So it was a great venue to have all sorts of things, and just a kind of a wonderful place to make sure that people come and see the best of what's on display. So, I mean, TRENZ obviously is the big event from a tourism calendar perspective, and it's a great opportunity for us to bring buyers and those in the tourism sector from all over the world to one place at one time to get a sense of what's happening in New Zealand. Tourism, as you probably know, is it's a big part of the New Zealand economy. So that's why we care a lot about it. As Prime Minister, it's normal for the Prime Minister in New Zealand to have another portfolio outside of kind of just being the Prime Minister. And I'm the first one that's ever taken tourism, but I really took it as a reflection of the fact that I think it's critical to New Zealand. And we're starting to see some very good results. I think, as you know, on Monday this week, it showed arrivals were up 13% on March last year. So basically, this year's been very strong. February's been stronger than February earlier. March has been the same. That's not to say that there aren't challenges, but there are lots and lots of opportunities for us. And I'll sort of get into kind of where we're going in terms of spending money. But the big focus of attention, I think, for New Zealand is to try and make sure that we branch out into new markets and attract more visitors from new markets while we increase the penetration in our existing markets. Secondly, to make sure that we are not overly dependent on one market. So roughly about half of all tourists that come to New Zealand come from Australia. And that's always probably going to be the case. It'll be a very big part of the tourism offering in New Zealand, simply because of geographic location. Australians come for very short periods of time sometimes, or they'll come, to ski for a week or whatever it might be, but they may equally come over for anything from a business meeting right through to, an opportunity to go and do things. Traditionally, we've had great support out of countries like the United Kingdom because people come to visit family. So if you look at migration patterns in New Zealand, which drives some of the tourist activity, we are growing as a population. So if you go back to early 1990s, we had 3.5 million people in New Zealand. Today we have 4.5 million. The United Kingdom's still the biggest single source of those tourists, or those migrants, should I say, but number 2 now is China, and number 3 is India. So the big population. Interesting enough, we're about to put out a report which is looking at economic activity around New Zealand. It has every region, you'll be pleased to know, Len, from sort of Auckland right through. So one of the things it shows is the average household income here in Auckland's just under $90,000. The other kind of slightly interesting, which is about at the high, as you'd expect, but the other thing that's quite interesting is it shows that no other city in the world has more foreign-born nationals living in it other than Vancouver. So number 1 in the world's Vancouver, number 2 is Auckland. So there's a lot of, there's a big Chinese community here, a big Indian community, people from, well over 100, I think 150 nationalities living in Auckland. And that is driving some of the sort of tourist flows that are taking place. The other thing is that we're trying to make sure that we have a unique offering. So we understand we're in a competitive world. Everybody's after tourists and everyone wants them to go to their country. So part of what we've been trying to do is spend more money in attracting those tourists. So that's about how we reach penetration with them. But partly it's making sure we have infrastructure that will encourage them to come at times that's off-peak. So, you're always going to get a lot of tourists turn up to New Zealand in January and February because people have Christmas holidays and the weather's nice and, there's a lot of great things to go and see and do. The challenge is, can we get them to come in April and August and those sorts of things? So we've been building quite a lot of infrastructure to try and support that, and the cycleway is a good example of that. It's pretty near completion. 12 of the trails have been opened. There's 18 in total, and the other 6 are not too far away. We're also looking at building convention centres. We're getting much closer to a convention centre being launched here in Auckland, or a significant international convention centre. We have one, but not one the size we want. Christchurch, as part of its rebuild, is going to have a major convention centre, and Queenstown's likely to have one as well. So it'll be part of an international offering of sort of 3 convention centres that we're working on. One of the challenges we've had to deal with is the rebuild of Christchurch. So just as a bit of a recap there, Christchurch is our second largest city. It's about 400,000 people live there relative to the 1.5 here, 1.5 million in Auckland. The earthquake had a very significant impact. So roughly half of all of the hotel beds in Christchurch were knocked out, and it had quite an impact on the tourist attractions there. That is starting to recover quite rapidly. So I was there last week, for instance, opening the gondolas that go up the hill. That tourist offering is back fully serviceable. The trams, for instance, and punting on the River Avon, all of those things are starting to come back. We're in the process of opening a number of hotels there, and the city is now definitely workable. It's definitely open for tourists, and there's an increasing number of tourists going there. The aftershocks have largely sort of settled down, and the rebuild is sort of full steam ahead. So there's a lot of activity kind of happening there. The other thing that we've been promoting pretty hard, obviously, has been around the Hobbits. So we see this kind of making of these big blockbuster premiere movies as a really good way to promote New Zealand, and I'm sure Kevin Bowler and Martin Stenton at some point of talking to you have sort of given some indication of the kinds of people that are coming to New Zealand directly because of the Hobbit movies, and directly because of their interest in going to see either where they were made, or the scenery on display has whet their appetite for what's available in New Zealand. So just in terms of just overall numbers, if you don't have them, tourism employs about 6% of the New Zealand total workforce. It generates $9.6 billion of revenue. It's touch over 15% of our export earnings, and it's 3.3% of total GDP in New Zealand. So pretty significant. On Sunday, I announced that the government was going to spend an additional $158 million on tourism promotion over the next 4 years. So we're going to spend in that time about $370 million. So you can get a sense of the magnitude of increases, nearly 50% more, so it's a lot. And it's going to give us lots of options. It's broadly being broken down to a number of buckets, which fundamentally, for the most part, Tourism New Zealand will be in control of, not in totality, but in part. So for a start off, firstly, we're looking at spending $44.5 million of the 158 in new markets or emerging growth markets like India and Latin America. So I was in Latin America a number of weeks ago. We met with the tourist community there, or the tourist agents, travel agents there. It's quite clear there's a lot of tourists from Latin America that want to come. So part of it is the promotion of New Zealand, and we're constantly working on building the air links between basically Latin America and New Zealand. We're going to spend about $24.5 million extra in our traditional markets, so the UK, Australia, those kinds of markets, Europe obviously, the west coast of the United States, which is a big market for us. $34 million is going to go into conventions and conferences and all of those things. For what it's worth, those who come to New Zealand for business reasons and conventions spend more. So on average, they spend $318 a day, as opposed to the average tourist that spends $208 a day. So one of the issues in New Zealand has been that the number of tourists has been going up, but the average spend has been going down. And obviously, we want to try and ensure that we have the number of tourists going up, but the average spend going up. We're also going to spend $20 million on the luxury end. So what's true in New Zealand is we have an ultra high-end offering, which kind of matches the beauty of the scenery. So it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about, Hooker Lodge, which has been there for a long time, or Kauri Cliffs, or Kidnappers, or Blanket Bay. I mean, right across New Zealand, there's now a range from sort of Wharikaha, all over the show, of these very high-end luxury 5- and 6-star resorts, and they're catering to a special market, but they're spending a lot of money money in New Zealand. And the last thing we're going to do is spend sort of 28 million of the 158 million on a thing called the Tourism Growth Partnership, where we work alongside regions and businesses. Just want to talk about China for a moment. Very important market potentially from New Zealand's perspective. So we got about 200,000 tourists from China last year. They're in broad terms our second biggest market behind Australia. Growth rate's been running at about 35% a year on year. Obviously we were at the Boao Forum in Hainan Island, where the President was talking about how much he sees the increase in the number of trips being taken by Chinese over the next 5 years. So New Zealand's got real potential to do much better in that market. There's a lot of direct connectivity and there's a lot of appetite. So from the government's point of view, we're doing a few things. One, spending more money in that market. That's an obvious thing to do. The second thing is we have to make it as convenient as possible for Chinese travellers to come to New Zealand. So we have entered particular arrangements with China Southern, who fly Guangzhou, Auckland every day, and with Air New Zealand, who are flying Shanghai, Auckland every day. So that means for their gold and sort of silver frequent card holders, they'll have a streamlined, speeded up process of being able to come to New Zealand. Second thing is that we've announced multi-entry visas. So if you come for a business trip to New Zealand, you can get a 3-year multi-entry visa, and for a holiday you can get a 2-year multi-entry visa. So we're speeding up that. We're spending more money on our migration services on the ground. So if you're getting a visa, it's getting processed hopefully under 5 days. It's costing you a bit less, and it's been translated to Mandarin. So we see big opportunities in that market to really do well. In terms of this thing called the Premier Kiwi Partnership, that's where we're kind of working alongside a whole lot of different entities to basically try and build that sort of unique offering with, again, tends to be high-end travellers. We're obviously got approved destination status from China, so that gives us a huge opportunity, and those specialist partner travel sellers are trying to sell into that sort of high-end market for us under that. Mentioned just briefly the cycle trails, they're progressing really well. What's happening there is we have, if you haven't looked at it, a number of online offerings, so people can come and have a look at what the trails look like. We've got an ambassador, which is Sarah Ulmer, who's previous Olympic gold medalist for New Zealand, and she's cycled a lot of the trails. There's little blogs up there, little videos you can look at. And what's absolutely happening is it's rejuvenating local communities, so you're seeing a lot of new businesses being established, from hiring bikes to accommodation to little museums, whatever it might be. I went on one myself in Queenstown the other day, and it was fantastic. I didn't fall off, and I had a great time. So they were two really good things. And you may have heard that, I think it was last week at the International Trails Symposium held in Arizona, New Zealand was recognised as, or New Zealand Cycle Trails, one of the best in the world. So we're starting to get international recognition. The other thing is that they are some of the trails use Department of Conservation land in New Zealand, so they're access into our dock estate, which is not always easy to get into. It just depends on where it is. So it's really opening up unique bits of the landscape in New Zealand. As I said, the Hobbit movie and Lord of the Rings is having a big impact on what we're seeing in terms of visitor arrivals. Quite a number of people indicating that they came for that reason. Christchurch I've sort of touched on, the convention centre I've touched on. Let me just sort of finish on a couple of things, then we can take any questions you want. The first thing is that adventure tourism for a certain sector in New Zealand is a big part of the offering. So lots of people come to New Zealand to throw themselves off a bridge, out of a plane, whatever it might be, have some sort of daredevil experience, and go home with the kind of DVD and the pictures and have a great time. Fun enough, my wife was just watching TV when I got home from some function I'd been at Friday night, and she was watching the International Travel Channel, and there were a couple of Canadians who'd been in New Zealand and Queenstown who managed to throw themselves off everything you could have ever imagined. So you can kind of imagine the profile it gets and the number of people who do that. There have been issues in New Zealand from time to time around the safety of those adventure tourism experiences. So what I guess I want to give you an assurance of is that the government takes the safety of people going on those adventure tourist attractions very seriously. So we have changed the regulations around that industry, the way that industry is audited. For the most part, it's had a very good safety record, and the vast overwhelming bulk of operators have been world-class, doing a good job for the people that go on their attractions. But one or two people have let the side down, and we can't put up with that. It's unacceptable to the government, because we need everybody that comes to have a good experience. In life there are always risks. You know, you can fall off a quad bike or you can have a problem. That is true in any country in the world, but it can't be because we don't have the world's best safety standards for those attractions. So that is one thing we've been doing a lot to improve. And secondly, one thing we've been working very closely with the industry on is to make sure they fully understand what their drug and alcohol policy should be for their employees, and that they're following those drug and alcohol rules properly. So that's one thing. The second thing that's had a little bit of media coverage internationally has been around just general safety and security of people coming to New Zealand and their possessions. So, you know, do they get mugged or do they get burgled? They're the kind of issues. And the answer there is, again, for the most part, people come to New Zealand, they're very safe, they have a good time, there are no real issues. But there have been one or two highlighted examples of where tour buses have had break-ins and the likes. So again, we've been working with the police to make sure that they're very active. They're working with the council and the operators to make sure that the tour operators are absolutely aware and vigilant about what they do, that they lock the buses, that there's often someone looking after the bus to make sure they're okay. And again, we take it very seriously if a tourist comes to New Zealand and has a bad experience. Again, there's always a risk in any part of the world. You can walk down the road almost anywhere and have a problem. But for the most part, New Zealand is a safe country. Our crime rate, believe it or not, is on a 30-year low in New Zealand. So we think we're doing pretty well in terms of crime. And if you measured us compared to any other international city in terms of Auckland or most other countries in the world, the crime rate is very low and the risk to someone being here is extremely low. But there are just 2 points I just wanted to make, that we take that stuff seriously. So that's probably enough for me.
Thanks.
Happy to take any questions you might want.
We'll do a Q&A now. Rose has got a microphone, and so if you want to ask a question, if you just identify yourself and then. But just to kick off, we've had a couple of questions submitted by international journos that are here. One of them, you've talked about the new focus on India. What do you think the key factors are to help us crack that market?
Yeah, so a few things. I mean, firstly, if you look at the Indian migration stats to New Zealand, a lot of them are young people coming to undertake language training and, but actually graduate studies in New Zealand. So a lot going to our universities, and they are then forming often their home in New Zealand. So basically the way it works in New Zealand, if you want to migrate to New Zealand as a permanent resident or ultimately as a citizen, we have what's called a points-based system, and we give you points relative to a whole number of different factors, and they include, you know, your tertiary qualifications and your age and all of these things. So if you happen to come to New Zealand and study in a New Zealand university, the probability of you getting permanent residency is extremely high. So you're seeing a lot of Chinese and Indian graduates who are going through our universities who ultimately decide to stay. That then brings a lot of tourists for their family and friends who come over, and often their parents will come and migrate under family reunification rules and the likes in New Zealand. So that's one thing. The second thing I think we'll see in India is an interest around particular events. So Cricket World Cup, which has been co-hosted by New Zealand and Australia, big event for 2015, and I think you'll see a massive number of tourists coming for Cricket World Cup from India and the likes. And thirdly, just generally, they come at sort of off-peak time, because it's obviously very hot in India, and so it's a time to come to New Zealand and sort of enjoy, you know, what we have on offer, which is quite different from the offering they have there. So we just got to keep working on those people-to-people links. Right.
Yeah, Alan Wood, Fairfax Media. Prime Minister, I was just going to ask, you mentioned the convention centres and particularly my interest, Christchurch and Queenstown. Can you give some sort of indication of the government funding for Christchurch and when you hope to see the first bit of the ground moved on that project?
I Okay, so in Christchurch, obviously, the location has theoretically been identified as part of the CBD plan, rebuild plan. In terms of money, those negotiations are ongoing at the moment between the council and the government and other interested parties. So we are progressing that, as I understand it, probably likely be part of a broader offering, potentially around hotel complex and the likes. So that's one thing. In terms of so that's work in progress. We'll know sooner, hopefully, as opposed to later, but we're working on it. In terms of Queenstown is going through a process at the moment, as I understand it, where it is going through a sort of draft design and consultation process. The council has identified land, and the land looks like it could be consented quite quickly. They haven't formally come to the government for money yet. But my guess is they probably will, from everything I hear every time I'm down there. So the best way to describe that would be, we wouldn't fund the bulk of the convention centre, nor does it look likely that we would need to, because there are quite a number of interested parties, but we're not ruling out putting in some cash.
Prime Minister? Yeah. Prime Minister, you just mentioned the increasing of the Chinese visitors. Right now it's about 200,000. So you say in the next 5 years, it could be more than 1 million. And I talked to some buyers from China, also local tourist operators. They're a bit concerned about the accommodation because, the Chinese New Year is a holiday season. It coincides with New Zealand summer high peak season. I think some Chinese buyers is even mentioned maybe in the Spring Festival in the January or February, very small number in the South Island. The tourist groups, the tourists cannot find accommodation. Even they have to stay in the hotel lobby or in the coach for some package tours.
Okay.
So, if a large number of Chinese visitors come to New Zealand, how would New Zealand prepare to accommodate such an increasing number? Thank you.
Yeah. So what's true is, if we're successful, and I'm convinced we will be, at increasing the number of tourists that come from overseas to New Zealand, and China's a big part of that push, we're going to need to build more infrastructure in New Zealand. And if you look at Auckland, there's plenty of capacity for us to build more hotels in Auckland. There's a number of sites that have been identified. I think there's a number of investors who are interested, some potentially from offshore as well, investing in that market. And I think it's a matter of really putting the two together. So you're right, I think, that over time we need to build more, but I'm very confident that's going to happen.
Matt Lennon from Travel Daily in Australia, Prime Minister. What work is being done to appeal to private investors to invest in New Zealand for tourism development? Yeah,
so the first thing is all foreign investment in New Zealand over a certain amount is governed by the Overseas Investment Act, which is an act of our Parliament, and there's an Overseas Investment Office that has a look at that the criteria of that investment, so an application can be made. For Australia, the rules are much more lenient than any other place. So Australian investors largely have an easier ride in investing in New Zealand because of our closer economic relations, our CER protocol. So we're more than happy for Australian investment to come into New Zealand into infrastructure assets. They would be welcome to be over here, and we're happy to work alongside them. And in a number of the public-private partnerships we can see being established, Australians are playing a role in that. So I don't think there'll be any issue about them coming in and building a hotel or building a particular tourist attraction. And it's actually true internationally as well. I mean, a number of the people we met in China when we were there about 10 days ago were on the investor side, and they're quite interested in investing in New Zealand. They'll have to go through a process slightly different for countries outside of Australia, but I'm very confident they'll get through. It's a pretty liberal, transparent regime.
Grant Bradley from the New Zealand Herald over here.
Sorry, Grant. Sorry, I lost you. I'm sorry.
Yes. You're spending a lot more on marketing New Zealand. Shortly before that announcement, there was cuts to DOC funding.
Yeah.
Are you confident that these cutbacks to DOC won't affect visitor experiences of these dock estates, and also a supplementary question. Your political opponents often have criticised you in the past for taking your family holiday in Hawaii.
Right.
Over summer. Are you going to rethink that, or you've seen what New Zealand's got to offer?
Okay, so let's start with the first one, which is in terms of DOC. DOC has been going through a series of restructuring exercises, as pretty much all government departments and ministries have. The latest round of changes, as the chief executive or the director made clear, was not about money. In fact, they would have made the changes irrelevant of how much money they had. It was about a change in the structure of what they wanted, and that was less middle management and fundamentally more being spent on rangers and people out in the field. So I am confident that we can accommodate people that come and use the DOC estate. We are looking to build the number of rangers. So I think in terms of the visitor experience that someone gets on the ground, there will be more people that they physically see as rangers. I think what is true is there'll be less middle management, but that's a deliberate exercise we're going on. In terms of, will I change my view of going away at Christmas to Hawaii? The answer is no. That's not because I don't think New Zealand's the best country in the world, and it's not because I don't love New Zealand, but actually, my political opponents have amnesia because their Prime Minister spent 9 years spending every Christmas overseas, last time I remember. She didn't quite tell people where she was going. I at least had the decency to say where I'm going. But the reason I go isn't because I don't love New Zealand or I don't want to go to my beach house that's up the road. The reason I go is because if I truly want to have a couple of weeks where it's just me and the family, given the other sort of 50 weeks of the year, it's 7 days a week, 360 odd days a year, I can't do that in New Zealand because you can't switch off being Prime Minister. If I walk down the road with the kids and 50 people want to take a photo of me, which they do, then that doesn't turn into a nice kind of cup of tea with the kids and a scone. It turns into a political exercise, and it would be very unfair on me to say to those people, well, I'm not going to take a photo with you because I'm on my Christmas holiday, because it would look rude, and I would just never do that. I'd always do it, and so there would be no family holiday for the kids, and I expect them and ask them to make huge sacrifices. So, if their Prime Minister hadn't spent 9 years going overseas, I'd say fair enough, but maybe they should go and check the record book.
Thanks, Prime Minister. And just to round off this session, we've had a fantastic week in Auckland. It's AT Auckland has done a wonderful job hosting us.
Yep.
This venue has been terrific, a great legacy from Rugby World Cup. What I'd like you to do now is to invite you to announce where TRENZ 2014 will be held.
Yeah, so TRENZ 2014 is going to be held back here, so we're coming back to AT, so Len will be happy and we're all happy. And look, it's a great place. I mean, we've had a little bit of rain, as you probably saw in the last, or when Len was speaking last half an hour, but actually, if you come from overseas, we're actually suffering from a drought, believe it or not. So funnily enough, the rest of the country is probably rejoicing that there's a bit of rain, but yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful part of New Zealand, and the waterfront's tremendously developing down here. And hopefully you're finding Auckland, a very multicultural, vibrant sort of city to be in. There's a lot of things to do here, and it's a great part of the world. And obviously in the rest of New Zealand has a unique set of offerings as well. And there's great beauty and great things to see. And lastly, we're a very friendly country. I saw some survey recently saying that we're one of the friendliest places on the planet, and I think that's absolutely true. I think most people that come to New Zealand come away and have a great experience, a wonderful holiday. They enjoy their time here and they have lots of memories. So we hope you'll have the same experience. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thanks very much.
Thanks everybody. That wraps up the media program for this morning, and for TRENZ 2013, I guess. If I could ask you to make your way downstairs now, this area is going to be used for a private function through morning tea time. So we need to make way for that. Thanks.